Krista Tippett is a journalist and has a podcast called On Being, which explores all things spirituality and meaning in the world. And she told of a time when she was at a gathering of nonprofit leaders who were grappling with thorny problems together. And someone was inexplicably joyful in the midst of this gathering. And someone else said, another leader of a nonprofit, "How can you possibly be joyful in a time like this?" Sometimes joy is preposterous, even offensive. I feel that on a day like today. How can we possibly be joyful in the state of this world when our government is sending people to an infamous prison in El Salvador without due process and refusing to change course? How can we possibly be joyful when the stock market is going crazy, when refugee camps are being bombed, when more than 40% of trans people tried to end their lives at some point? Might being joyful be the equivalent of burying our heads in the sand, or at least require burying our heads in the sand? If you feel overwhelmed by the state of the world or your own life, if joy feels inaccessible to you today, if joy feels preposterous or even offensive, you'll find good company in the women at the tomb on Easter. Well, at least that's the case in the Gospel of Mark. At least that's the case in the original ending of the Gospel of Mark. So all four Gospel writers, Matthew, I was going to ask you to tell me, who are the four Gospel writers? I just gave one away, you got a freebie. So what's the first one? Nice. Each of the four Gospel writers tell the story of the resurrection, and each of them tells it a bit differently. Matthew, Luke, and John all have the women arriving to the empty tomb and then running away exuberantly to tell the other apostles the good news that Jesus has risen. But in the Gospel of Mark, at least in the original ending, as I said, we'll talk about that more in a few minutes, it's a different kind of ending to the story. So let's read the resurrection story in the Gospel of Mark. We already read part of it at the beginning of the worship service, but I didn't want to spoil the ending with something a little bit sad or confusing, so I skipped this part when we read it at the beginning. I figured we needed a little warm up for this. So let's read Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and the mother of James and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's been raised. He is not here. Look, this is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So what did the women do? Did they do what the young man dressed in the white robe told them to? No. Did you catch that? How are they feeling? Corey, can you put that last verse up again? How are they feeling? What were they feeling as they fled the tomb? Terror and amazement. They fled. They disobeyed the instructions of who's become called to be an angel, though here it's just a young man in a white robe. They fled for fear and amazement, and they didn't tell a soul. So if joy feels inaccessible to you today, you'll find good company with these two Marys and Salome. This past week, in preparation for this sermon, I discovered a man named Ross Gay, who is a poet, an essayist, and a professor. Also a former college football player, curiously. Just a little background information here. He never imagined that he would become a poet because he did terribly in school. But he loved football, so his original idea of what to do with his life was to go into the NFL. But then, just as he was about to flunk out of college and therefore become ineligible to play, he discovered poetry in one of his classes, and everything changed for him. So here's what Ross Gay said in an interview with Krista Tippett that stopped me in my tracks this week. "We are good at fighting," Dr. Gay says. "We are good at fighting, but imagining and holding in our imagination what is wonderful and to be adored and preserved and exalted is harder for us, it seems. We're good at fighting, but imagining what is wonderful and to be adored and preserved and exalted is harder for us." Do you feel that in the flight of the two Marys and Salome away from the empty tomb? Overcome by their fight, flight, or flee instinct, they couldn't imagine a reality beyond the fact that their beloved Jesus was executed by the government because he stood up to injustice. This fight, flight, flee thing, when it happens in our bodies, hijacks our brains and steals our ability to imagine, so that our gray matter that processes delight and beauty and wonder falls silent. The two Marys and Salome could tell you all about this, as if you needed to be told. You all know what this is like. And when we're perpetually in that fight, flight, or flee state in our nervous systems, eventually these muscles that bring us delight, that show us wonder, eventually they atrophy. And with all the chaos in our world today, it makes joy feel inaccessible. That makes perfect sense if that's where you are today. It's no wonder that the two Marys and Salome didn't tell anyone about the stone being rolled away, about the young man dressed in the white robe, and the news that Jesus had risen. It's no wonder that in the original ending of Mark, they fled in silence, keeping this good news under wraps. But Jesus knew. Jesus knew that his new life, his nonviolent triumph over the oppressive powers of empire and religion, he knew that it was so far out from what the two Marys and Salome could hold in their minds that he kept poking at them. The story kept begging to be told that Jesus is risen, that oppression and injustice do not have the last word. Thanks be to God for the persistence of this good news over the fear and the flight and the fleeing of the two Marys and the Salome. Back to Ross Gay. He was walking along a path in Italy that he found brought him joy. This was after his college football days when he was establishing himself as a writer. And he suddenly thought that it would be a fun intellectual experiment to write a short essay about a pleasant experience every day for a year, beginning on his birthday, August 1st. For this project, he set some rules for himself. Draft them quickly, which would be hard for me. I am a perpetual and obsessive editor of what I write. Draft them quickly, write them by hand. 2 rules: draft them quickly, write them by hand, and 1 every day. That makes it a discipline, a practice. Spend time thinking and writing about delight every day, and the result is his book called The Book of Delights, and then a subsequent book called The Book of More Delights. And here's what Dr. Gay said about this project. It didn't take me long to learn that the discipline or practice of writing these essays occasioned a kind of delight radar. Or maybe it was more like the development of a delight muscle, something that implies that the more you study it, the more delight there is to study. That the more stuff you love, the happier you will be, and the more stuff you will love. And I would add, what a wonderful way to practice resurrection. This discipline of joy, this development of a delight radar, when combined with the fight for justice that Jesus calls us to, is the key to working with God to repair the world. Here's one thing Dr. Gay noticed when he started to pay attention. Here's an excerpt from one of his essays on delight. I suppose I could spend time theorizing about how it is that people are not bad to each other, but that's not really the point. The point is that in almost every instance in our lives, our social lives, we are, if we pay attention, in the midst of an almost constant, if subtle, caretaking. Our default is to notice all the bad that people do to each other. But he began to notice this constant but subtle caretaking. People holding open doors, offering elbows at crosswalks, letting someone else go first. All of those things happen to me. I'm not the elbow at the crosswalk, but holding an open door and having someone else invite me to go first, those things happened to me just this morning. And if I hadn't read this from Dr. Gay, I wouldn't have thought anything of it. Helping with the heavy bags, reaching what's too high or what's been dropped, pulling someone back to their feet, stopping at the car wreck or the struck dog. The alternating merge, also known as the zipper merge, this kind of caretaking, when we can do it, I'll add from someone in West Michigan, this caretaking is our default mode. And it's always a lie that convinces us to act or believe otherwise. Always. He says in another place, I played college football. And I got a scholarship in college because I could hurt people. Basically, that's what it is. Sometimes people are like, well, aren't you skilled at the game? No, I mean, yeah, but it's because I could hurt people. That's what it is. And in the midst of that as well, in addition to all kinds of brutality and stupidity, we could debate that, is all this tenderness. In fact, some of the tenderness, I think, of it is having my right MCL blown out by a good chop block from someone, and having my buddy Glenn running down the field to pick me up. This caretaking is all around us if we have eyes to see, and anything that convinces us otherwise is a lie. Without a delight radar, without holding out the vision for this beautiful world that is worth fighting for, we can only bring about temporary justice with all our fighting, to change, to shift what fighting means. With all of our fighting for justice, we can only bring about temporary justice without the practice of delight. We'll get cynical, we'll get burnt out, we'll turn to violence. Something will happen if we don't keep this vision of God's beautiful world before us. Why do you think it is that Jesus went to so many parties, changed water into wine, fed people in a beautiful, delightful, unexpected way? Why do you think Jesus healed so many people, hung out with so many fun misfits? It's because Jesus had a delight radar. He wanted us to catch on to his imagination of beauty. He wanted us to catch on to his vision, what he could see of a world where poverty doesn't exist, where everyone can live a fully alive life, where the lion and the lamb are no longer predator and prey, but housemates, where enemies become friends. Jesus wants us, and humanity needs us, to see that this world already exists in fits and starts. This world of beauty and justice and the fully alive life is already happening. And it is our joyful duty to develop this delight radar and to keep our imaginations open to joy. It's a discipline. It's something we need to work at. We're not going to get it right every time. Even those who were closest to Jesus, the two Marys and Salome, didn't get it right at first. But do you remember earlier I said the original ending of the Gospel of Mark? It's a provocative thing to say. Here's a bit of Bible nerdery. Out of the four Gospels, the Gospel of Mark was written first. So the earliest, it was written years before the other Gospels were written. And it's the rawest, meaning it has the least amount of polishing that developed as more time went by and as communities lived with the good news of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. They started, the other gospel writers, I don't want to say they embellished, but they might have embellished the stories to fill them out, to add the details, things that they newly remembered that the earlier gospel writer of Mark had not. So there's something raw and probably original about these two Marys and Salome fleeing, with terror clouding out their amazement, with closed mouths and hiding bodies. But the original ending of Mark is based on the earliest, so with every biblical text, there are these fragments that they pick up along the way, that they discover in archaeological work, like little fragments of scrolls that they find, or sometimes bigger fragments, and they piece them together, and they can use science to determine when these texts were written, when these scrolls were written. And the earliest, the oldest fragments have only this original ending. But fragments of the Gospel of Mark, other copies that they found that were dated later, had things that are now called the intermediate ending of Mark and the longer ending of Mark. And it's in these alternative endings that communities added to the Gospel of Mark later along the way, where we find the two Marys and Salome telling the story of the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus was persistent with this good news, not only with the original disciples, but also with the communities as they passed on this good news from one to the next, and they knew that something was missing. They knew that the story had been told and passed on somehow. And so they added these later endings because they knew that good news needs to be shared. So they rewrote the story of the two Marys and Salome in a beautiful and gifted way. They rewrote the stories. They opened the mouths of these three women so that the good news could go out. They knew of the delight radar. They had more practice as generations of Jesus followers went on. Because good news begs to be shared. That's the beauty of the delight radar, is when we take in delight, it doesn't stay within us, right? When you have good news, you're bursting out to share it. It's one of my favorite things about Sunday mornings is seeing the looks on some of your faces when I can see that you have something exciting to tell me. Good news bursts out from us and we want to share it. And then we can develop this shared vision of the beautiful world that Jesus gave to us. And it is that delight and that shared joy that will fuel our fights for justice. So, the invitation for you today is to practice resurrection by developing a delight radar. Develop a delight radar. Maybe follow Dr. Gay's example and write something every day that gives you delight. And you'll start to build this muscle of delight and noticing joy. The joy of a beautiful flower. The joy of the way the light shines on the wall of your office or your bedroom for a fleeting moment. And then there's a bird shadow that comes into that light on the wall, and it changes everything. What is your delight? Pursue it. That is how we practice resurrection. Develop a delight radar. Will you join me in prayer? God, thank you for so many ways that we see ourselves in Scripture. The way that fear crowds out our ability to imagine a different reality. Thank you for that story of the two Marys and Salome, which is not a story of shame, but a story of real living with good news in the midst of suffering. And thank you for the coming communities over the generations who shaped and formed and added to the stories to explain how the good news was shared and how the good news spread. Help us to be joy mongers. Help us to grow in our delight radar, to see your light reflected in the beauty around us and to share it with others. And may that spur us on to fighting for the justice and the realities that you have put before us. In your name we pray, amen.